Welcome to session 9 of the Critical Realism reading group. Today, Priscilla is going to be talking to you about how to change the world, which sort of sums up the whole point of the preceding sessions, and specifically about utopias. So over to you, Priscilla.
Thank you, Rob, and welcome to everybody. So how can critical realism assess research intended to change the world? Marx said that philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. I would like to recommend John Molyneux's excellent book, The Point is to Change It. It's not about critical realism, but it's a short introduction to Marxism and dialectic. It's very useful. Of course, research alone cannot change anything, but it can provide the knowledge and analysis needed to inform change. Critical realism emphasizes explanatory critique, which not only critically analyzes problems of accuracy and logic and thinking, but also moral problems of benefit and harm. And there's also great interest in eudaimonia, happiness, prosperity, or the free flourishing of each as a condition for the free flourishing of all. Creative flourishing is seen as the highest good, with the idea that we can only flourish as long as everyone does, and we're not doing so at the expense of other people's exploitation or suffering. Critical realism is also interested in recognizing explicitly the values at the heart of research. So, of course, all health and social research, in a way underlying, is about promoting well-being and trying to absent ills that increase physical, mental, and social problems. All education research, in a way, is to promote skill and knowledge. But they raise questions. How are well-being, flourishing defined? By whom? And in whose interests? For instance, when the well-being of school children are being defined by different groups, they differ very much on the ideas of what is helpful, what flourishing means, whether it's something that should be postponed until later on in adulthood, and whose interests are being served. So critical realism is very keen to explicitly address these questions that underlie all research. We're being reminded so graphically this month of the three great dangers and crises facing us: the climate crisis, war and peace, and world health. And they all remind us that everyone is interconnected. The world's problems and hopes are all interconnected, and they need to be understood through the range of natural and social sciences. And yet, there are so many splits within as well as between the different sciences, with our different theories and methods and journals and departments. And we often never meet people working in the same topic areas as us, but in a different discipline or method. So critical realism is interested in bringing them all together into a common framework for analysis and reminding us of natural necessity that all the sciences involve the empirical, actual and real. That the social and natural sciences are not uniform, but they are unified. And they're partly in the search for mainly unseen causes, not just patterns between effects. So, for example, when we document, describe, measure the many effects of climate change, but it's also vital to look at the causes, the greenhouse gases. The same with pandemics. All the research done on the effects would be very little use without recognizing the key cause of the transmission of the virus. With the Ukraine war, and recently I've gone to a meeting about the Yemen war that's been going on for 7 years. What are the many causes and the means to prevent future war and to resolve present conflicts? And so this is like doctors who search for the cause, the hidden cancer tumor, for example. don't just treat the pain. Now, judgment is so vital in research. We've watched for months and months the Downing Street meetings where the scientists are on one side with their facts and the politicians are on the other side with their policies. But the public professor of health, David McCoy, the professor of public health, David McCoy, said about the pandemic, it's not just science versus policy, facts versus interpretation, it's much more complicated. We must better acknowledge the limitations of evidence-based policy and recognize the importance of expertise, experience, and sound judgment. This is illustrated in a current move by our government to save money by making our family doctor GP medical services automated to save costs. So patients are now supposed to ring up, list their problems, and a computer decides what should be done with them. However, the computers very much over-refer patients to other services, whereas GPs know that many of the patients they meet every day need only advice or simple treatment, and they know that from years and years of judgment and experience, so that their service is more cost-effective and efficient because of judgment. Roy Basker would talk of the Holy Trinity, and it was partly a pun on holy as very important, sacred, and holy as full of holes and absences. So he would think of three stages. First of all, we must begin with ontological realism, which is vital if we are to accept intransitive problems and remedies, such as for global heating. We have to begin with the factual realities. But then we meet epistemological relativism. We accept that our understanding is limited, fallible, partial, socially produced, and transitive. Real independent ontology, stage one, cannot be collapsed into our fallible human perceptions. But are we just lost in a maze of different ideas and arguments? No, because stage three accepts that we do have judgmental rationality. We can recognize our ability to adjudicate between ontology, epistemology, and morality in order to criticize the present and progress towards new futures through critical debate and analysis. Now, critical realism shows how in the social sciences, all the subspecialties relate to one another, from history to philosophy to psychology to economics to law. All these subspecialties relate to one another, and they're positioned with the larger concepts of social science and the humanities. And they have different paradigms, and critical realism looks at how and why the paradigms differ, their respective strengths and limitations. Critical realism brings in coherent, critical, practical ways in which social science can analyze structure and agency, society and nature, macro and micro, theory, culture, values, truth, transformative change. Many of these are seen as dichotomies, whereas critical realism brings them together into dialectics. There are also bringing in agreed theories about the nature of society and knowledge, ontology and epistemology, and how knowledge is validated. And also it brings in practical ways of connecting knowledge from the natural and social sciences into public opinion, policy and practice. And that was what was really needed in the Downing Street meetings, wasn't it? To how do we connect the scientists and the politicians? What are the bridges and links and analytical connections? So with coordinating the sciences and society, John Urry, a sociologist who sadly fairly recently died, but did use critical realism partly, said that sociology not economics, which is usually assumed, should be the expert social science to lead in coordinating and interpreting all relevant knowledge. Now, critical realism would agree with that, but might put it slightly differently, that sociology could connect, coordinate, underlabour at the service of interdisciplinary research by analysing hidden and assumed theories and problems. So it's rather being more the servant than the leader, perhaps. With, say, the wars in Ukraine and Yemen, that there are so many causes, voices, and values in the past and in the present and also the future that need so much connecting analysis. As you probably all know, Alexis de Tocqueville, the 19th century explorer and sociologist who thought that positivism should be the new religion, said that in democratic countries, knowledge of how to combine is the mother of all other forms of knowledge, and on its progress depends that of all the others. Sociology can be the bridge between the natural sciences and people's everyday life, relationships, social structural context, personal values, and the means to promote political and personal change towards more healthy and eco-friendly behaviours. This is Elizabeth Shove, not Shove, talking, who specialises in how we can react to the global heating. Now, I want to quote Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, a doctor, who listed the essential interdisciplinary work on the COVID-19 pandemic 2 years ago, but still so relevant. Only by coming together will the world be able to face down its shattering consequences. We must ensure a sufficiently global and coordinated response to the pandemic, and then build resilience for the future. And he said, first, we need medical and social management to reduce illness. But second, we need to tackle the devastating social and economic dimensions of the crisis, support low-income countries to prevent resurgence of the pandemic. And in our interconnected world, we are only as strong as the weakest health systems. No one is safe from COVID until everyone is. And third, we need to build more inclusive and sustainable economies and societies that are more resilient to disasters. This is a moral imperative and a matter of enlightened self-interest. And this requires extraordinary measures, a colossal test, which demands decisive, coordinated, and innovative action from all, for all. So we need extensive information, strategy, and clear, effective communication. They're all essential to public health, he said. If we are to persuade people to change their behaviour, we cannot enforce these global changes. They can only come through dialogue and persuasion. This involves, of course, research that combines quantitative and qualitative. And as I mentioned before, even if you're doing a small, very small, low-cost, short study, with your literature review and analysis, you can nest it inside multidisciplinary literature reviews, large surveys, systematic reviews, the history, geography, policy, public debates, current affairs, think tank reports, lots of online resources that will resonate with your analysis. And through this, of course, we always need interdisciplinary research through the possibility of naturalism, the social and natural sciences being uniform but not unified, working on all four planes of social being, all interacting in time and space. Now, I'd like to talk to you about utopian research, which Roy Basker was very interested. He took the idea from Ernst Bloch of concrete utopias, creative fantasies, but quite different from abstract utopias. Now, Adorno would have probably classified Bloch and Basker as among the very few philosophers who are not afraid of a world without domination and hierarchy. Basker was very inspired by the socialist artist William Morris from the 19th century. Maybe many of you have read his utopian novel, News from Nowhere and the Function of Utopia. And he wanted to construct practical models of alternative ways of living that on the basis of assumed sets of resources. And the great political movements do this. The Black movement has completely new ideas of what societies could be like. And rearrangement of sets of resources like reparation for slavery are key to their thinking. The Green movement is thinking of redistributing wealth in order that we can invest in tackling climate change, instead of having this idea of growth where wealth and resources go up to the pyramid to the top, respread the wealth and prosperity. Now, concrete utopias counterbalance actualist blueprints, which can be very limited and too much confined to the present. We'll see later the problem with this, which involves inflexible planning. Utopian research can inform hope. Also, it involves the dialectic of emancipatory freedom and the positive in the negative. So the negative can be everything elsewhere, everything possible, everything absent. Let's explore it. It can be so positive. Concrete utopias means well-rounded, fit for purpose, and it links to concrete universalism, another critical realism concept. It also links to depth praxis. As you probably know, praxis is a Marxian idea of practical change that links to theory and research analysis. And depth, of course, refers partly to the empirical, actual and real on all four planes of social being. And that can pinpoint the real, though not actualized, boundless possibilities in a situation. And here real will mean underlying deep causal movements that are pushing forward change or pulling it back and need to be unraveled. So we often act as social utopians. We often act as social utopians believe we could act in solidarity and trust, for instance. For instance, we've seen the overwhelming response to refugees from Ukraine, which has startled and amazed the politicians who thought that they could win votes on being very mean and hostile to immigrants. But among the public, this is great wave of solidarity, trust and generosity that would no doubt be publicized far more if there were different political climates. And this means moving on to be free from endism, end of history ideas, which are actually negative utopias. Oh, Tina, oh, there is no alternative. We can't be different. It's just all hopeless, or it just may all remain the same. Any alternatives are only dangerous and useless fantasies. So we've got to be free from that endism. And MELD helps very much in the stepping forward in the open-ended connected cycles and stages, moving from power 2 to power 1. So I'll just mention a few utopian research methods which have been very much developed by non-critical realist authors, but are very relevant and useful to critical realists. So Olin Wright advocated emancipatory social science to research real practical utopias. And this questions why we want to change, where we aim for, and the theories of transformation on how we might get there. So it's both practical and analytical. Roberto Unger called for democratic incremental reforms that are desirable, viable, and achievable through shared practical exploration. We might be able to act differently and more collectively in the world and open up new utopian possibilities. So this combines the thinking and analysis with the actual practical living and being of doing utopias. Ruth Levitas is probably the best known British utopian thinker, and she has says urgently needed utopian thinking points us towards expressing the desire for better ways of living and being. And we can ponder systemically and concretely about possible futures by imagining an entirely different society. And we partly do this through prefigurative practice, our attempts to live out in this world the relationships and practices of an imagined better future might make that future more realizable, start being the utopias, and then maybe we'll be able to get towards them. So imagine utopian future well-being. The fact of our imaginings will fall short and will end in necessarily failure, but that does not excuse us from trying. So sociology can uniquely understand the matrix of social interactions with socially defined needs, wants, and satisfactions, says Ruth Levitas. Human happiness demands that we find ways of engaging with one another that allow less fear, more genuine connection, more love within deeper, more satisfying human relationships. And we can attend to what we might become rather than fixed ascribed identities with and we can insist on utopian ontology as processual and dynamic, moving on constantly from one step to the next step to the next step. So also speculative sociology is explicitly normative and is desperately needed. Now, utopian method is not prediction or prescription or even prophecy. It must not entail multiple provisional and reflexive accounts. Sorry, it must now entail multiple provisional and reflexive accounts of how we might live through imaginative possibilities, the negative positive, rather than blueprints, which are in epistemology and evidence-based. The methods involve radical being and doing ontology through journeys that reach new horizons and understanding. Now, when you go hill walking, you know that the near horizon gets nearer and nearer, and there's nothing beyond it. And then suddenly you get to the top and a whole new vistas open before you with new potential routes and possibilities. And that's why detailed planning ahead may be very limited, because we don't know what's ahead of us until we get to each new horizon, each new stage. New people might join the project, or new knowledge open up great new questions and problems and possibilities. So that's why we don't need to have too much detailed plans of step by step, but we also always need to keep to the final goal, the general direction, even though we might go there slightly different routes. Now, David Harvey, the Marxist professor of geography, saw each local community practically working out new ways of living through constant, creative, critical dissent, change, and experiment. And it's about the journey over the arrival, he said, though we must keep to the main goal. Rada Souza is a critical realist, and she's analysed flaws in conventional sociology that prevents analysis of social change in utopias. Critical realist totality can overcome the flaws by containing diverse, contradictory contexts and structures, actors and values. Totality is particularly important at stage 3 of MELD, isn't it? Bringing seeming contradictions together into interacting dialectics. So she says, a fact or event, every fact or event, is the convergence of multiple facets of reality, each with its own history and geography, trajectories and processes that come together at a given moment in the convergence of multiple domains of reality at empirical, structural and ontological levels. She contrasts this complexity with the mercantile research, where we've got graphs and numbers and statistics, where each isolated fact is divorced away from all its complex contexts. This is such a very useful article on the problem of research about atomized facts instead of about multiple, emergent, interacting complex realities in order that we can think about utopias. So later on in the discussion, I hope you'll be able to talk about, do you agree that researchers should aim to change the world, not just interpret it? And if so, how does or might your research support this work? And you might also like to talk about utopias and whether you think they're realistic and sensible to do or not. And let's just leave this slide on for a little while, Rob, because people might want to take a photo of it or something for the references, and particularly the Sousa reference in the Journal of Critical Realism, volume 12, and also the Shove reference and the Ungar and Levitas. And also this talk was based on chapter 7 of my 2021 book. Thank you. Rob.
Thanks very much, Priscilla. Hang on a sec, let me just stop.